Hello, welcome to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and we will be talking about South Asians in the US and immigrant rights with Professor Monisha Das Gupta from University of Hawaii at Manoa. Monisha, thank you so much for joining us here today. So we are going to learn today about the diversities in the Southeast Asian community in the US, their effort in building social justice organizations and labor issues faced by the Southeast Asian immigrants, and also post 9/11 issues faced by the South Asians in the US. Just give you a bit of a background about Professor Monisha Das Gupta. She is a associate professor of ethnic studies and women's studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa, and she's also the director of the Center for South Asian Studies in the School of Pacific and Asian Studies. And she's been involved in multiracial efforts to organize for immigrants' rights in the US, and her current research examines anti-deportation activism. She has written extensively on these issues. She's the author of Unruly Immigrants, Rights Activism and Transnational South Asian Politics in the United States. And she's also written on social justice issues and also relationships between scholarship and activism. She's actually participating in some of these important efforts herself. And one of her fascinating articles I just recently read is on the impact of 9/11 on New York City taxi drivers. We are going to actually explore that toward the end of today's show. So again, thank you so much for being here. So Monisha, maybe we need to kind of start from the beginning in terms of looking at the South Asian immigrants to the US. Maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of when did they start to come, where do they tend to be situated, located?
So first, thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm really honored to be here. South Asian migration to the United States, dates back almost to the birth of the Republic, but the contemporary flow, starts around 1965 when the United States starts to liberalize its immigration laws. And as you know, there was unanticipated sort of flow of migrants from Asia. Mm-hmm. So, before that, Asian migrants to the United States were either barred from coming, and they were definitely excluded from citizenship. So there were a lot of structural barriers to migration from that area.
Okay, before you go further, we need to take a short break to fix something very quick.
Aloha, this is Martin Despang, co-host of the Urban Transcendence show by Alejandra Yamashita and Martin Despang. And me being an architect and an educator in architecture, I'm really interested in that we make our urban environment here in downtown Honolulu as exciting, invigorating, and challengingly beautiful as our wonderful paradise natural environment. We're going to bring in guests from a diversity of areas that help us to learn how we can achieve that goal that shouldn't be that hard to reach. So we look very much forward to see you then. Thank you.
Hi, we're back. That was a short break, and we had to fix some things over here. Hopefully you were able to hear the earlier conversation, had to fix the microphone. That was Professor Monisha Das Gupta talking about South Asians in the US. So we started with talking about when they came. 1965 is a major time period. And so where do you find more South Asians in the US?
So I also wanted to just clarify that when we refer to South Asians, we are referring to migrants from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. Depending on your definition of South Asia, we also include Bhutan as well as Afghanistan and sometimes Burma.
That's a good geographical clarification.
So it's a very diverse group. It's a large area with different nation states. But we can say that, you know, the flow from these nation states to the United States kind of started in 1965, and the migrants usually tended to settle either on the northeast, you know, especially the tri-state area, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut, as well as on the west coast, California being one of the biggest sort of receiving states in terms of South Asian migration. We didn't see so many people, you know, in the South, but right now, Houston in Texas has become a big hub for South Asians, especially because of the technology industry there. And we see more and more South Asians in the South as well as the Midwest. So I would say that it is slowly becoming a national phenomenon from a very regional phenomenon. But I will, you know, still people tend to first go to the East Coast, to these Northeast states as well as California.
What about Hawaii? You know, we do see some South Asians here.
So, you know, when I when I did my job interview in Hawaii, of course, you know, I was very curious about the South Asian community there because in Boston I worked within the South Asian community, both as an activist, you know, also it was my social circle. And everybody was very, you know, diplomatic about the number of South Asians. And I asked them, you know, if there was even an Indian spice store. And
I thought there is one in Honolulu, right?
There is one, but there wasn't one when I moved here.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, it's the man from Fiji who opened up India Market.
That's what I heard.
and that's fine. But, you know, that kind of goes to show what a radical change it was for me to move from the East Coast to Hawaii, where, you know, I think there are about 1,000, you know, residents of South Asian origin. However, I have discovered that there is a large temporary workforce who come in for various, you know, to offer their technical skills. So somebody told me that on King Street there is a Mexican place that serves very hot food, and if I go there at lunchtime, then I'll meet a lot of South Asians.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we also have a very vibrant Nepali community. We have a very vibrant Bangladeshi community. So even though we are small, I think we reflect the diversity of our sending regions. And, you know, we have a small but very enthusiastic community.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting, you talk about, you know, immigrants coming from so many different countries, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and other places. And you also know that even within the region, there's some conflicts and people don't always get along.
Yes.
So in terms of looking at South Asian immigrants, you know, I'm sure there's so much, so many different things going on, different groups going on. Yeah, talking about diversity, right?
Yes.
Do people tend to identify themselves as South Asians, or are you talking more like I'm Indian, I'm not necessarily South Asians?
That's a really key point. I think that people who say identify as South Asians have been politicized to talk about a regional identity rather than a national identity, but most people will identify by their national identity. So, and if you are, you know, if they're talking to somebody from the region, they will even go more local. So, you know, they will identify by ethnicity. You know, so for example, people will say, I'm from Punjab, but Punjab was split between Pakistan and, you know, India. So then they will talk about, you know, where you know, that they are from Pakistan or they are from India, which side of the border they are from. So I think that these regional identities, you know, like regional within South Asia, are very much alive, and that is also communicated to the second generation that has grown up here. So it's a very interesting dynamic. South Asian is not, you know, necessarily the most popular term within, you know, just in common usage. People would, you know, identify by nation and then, you know, either by their caste-based community, religion, and locality.
That said, what's interesting is that I wonder whether these different immigrant groups are facing some of the common issues.
I think that they are, especially because, they're lumped together once they're in the United States. One of the things that I've learned from my research is that very quickly they learn that they're lumped together. And in fact, because somehow, India being sort of the hegemonic presence in South Asia, most people will see, a South Asian person and tend to talk about them as Indians. And I know that Bangladeshis, for example, they're very patriotic. In my lifetime, I've seen them struggle for their independence. So they always correct, people.
I'm not from India.
I'm not from India. I'm from Bangladesh. We had an independence struggle. It's always a sort of teaching moment for them when, people in the United States sort of, lump them together with Indians. But there are a lot of common issues that people face, and I think that's how this, label South Asian came up, because, to indicate, just like we use Asian American, we use South Asian American to indicate that, we do have common issues,
That's
even
right.
as we come from very different contexts, cultural and regional contexts.
Talk about issues, especially issues related to immigrant rights. What are they? Can you kind of give us a list?
Sure, yeah. That has been my passion, and as you know, Hong, people from, migrants from Asia are often, sort of when they come to this country, because of, the ways in which immigration laws were crafted, we are seen as the model minority, right? As very successful, always professional, as if we are always, in the professions. And, whenever people talk to me about my ethnicity here, whether it is in Hawaii or on the continent, they're always, talking about the doctors and lawyers they know who are South Asian. And I think my work has been to actually say that, yes, of course, there is this whole professional class who came because of the 1965 laws that were geared toward recruiting professionals, especially in the field of health. But there are also working class South Asians. There are also, South Asians whose class status drops once they come to the United States because they're survivors of domestic violence. And, the question then becomes, when immigration laws are geared toward, bringing in professionals, how come we have, this working class segment of our, of our community? And I think that, when I started my research, talking about domestic workers who are South Asian or taxi drivers who are South Asian, was very surprising to people because they didn't see our community that way. They didn't see all the waiters in the Indian restaurants or all the people who are driving them around in cabs. And I'm like, well, where do you think they come from?
That's right.
So, those issues are issues around, surviving as an immigrant in this country. And, I pay attention to issues that arise out of gender inequality. I look at issues that arise out of, workplace inequality in terms of wages and work conditions. And also, gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and queer identified South Asians. So, my activism on the East Coast especially was very much in those communities.
Also, some of these issues tend to be not just uniquely South Asian community issues, right?
Yes, yes. And I think that is sort of the very exciting phase in which we are now. As a person who has been looking at our activist history in this country, in the 80s, I think we were, articulating our issues as South Asians, as South Asian immigrants. What are we facing here in this country, right? And right now, I think that, we've become more mature as, rights-based, at the rights-based organizations. And so we have built solidarities with other, ethnic groups or other, occupational groups that are facing the same kinds of issues. So it's less, I would say, based on just ethnic identity and more based on issues that we are confronting as workers or as, survivors of domestic violence or as people who live in, urban communities.
That's really interesting. So let's take a quick break, and after the break, we can get to talk about some of these efforts. You personally have been involved in bringing justice to the immigrant communities. Again, this is ThinkTech Asia, And we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel, CEO of ThinkTech. On Thursday, December 11th, we're having our annual reunion party. We call it ThinkTech United. It's at the Laniakea YWCA. It's for our speakers and hosts and moderators and friends. Please come down. Everybody is invited to be united. We'll see you there. Check our website for details. Aloha.
Hi, we're back. We're live. This is ThinkTech Asia. And we've been talking with Professor Monisha Das Gupta from UH-Manoa on South Asians in the U.S. and immigrant rights. So let's start with your personal involvement in terms of the efforts to bring justice and secure immigrant rights.
Yeah, I was a graduate student and based in Boston, and I met other South Asian women who were really sort of interested in building a community and, coming together as feminists, South Asian feminists. And I remember we went to a community meeting at a community center, and all these older women, who I would say, lovingly were, we addressed as aunties, in a familial fashion. They came to the meeting and they were, spread in suburbs, because in Boston, the South Asian community was not so much living in the city, but in suburban areas where, they're pretty isolated. And they said that, for many years now, we've been supporting survivors of domestic violence. We've been safe houses for, women who are escaping abusive relationships. So why don't you young women who have so much energy do something about this? And I think that that's how, my activism and involvement in the South Asian community started. So I started to sort of awaken to the world of feminist activism in among South Asians in the United States, and then through that I learned about labor organizing that was happening, which was very eye-opening to me. And the feminist organizations also had, good relationships with the LGBTQ community, and again with them, with South Asians who were LGBTQ. One of the issues was that they were not accepted in the community. They were not openly talked about in the community. They often hid their sexual orientation. At the same time, they were not accepted in very white gay and lesbian context, because culturally they didn't fit in. So I think that all of these issues became points of organizing within the community in terms of asking for their rights and articulating their rights.
Are there any particular issues that's kind of a uniquely experience of South Asians that you were involved?
I would say, each of these issues bring up, unique, sort of a unique set of issues that these groups confront. But I would say, especially post 9/11, the ways in which South Asians have been targeted in the context of Islamophobia, in the context of the xenophobia that developed after after the 9/11 attacks, has been, we've had to sort of really respond to it as a South Asian issue.
That's interesting, and we're going to talk more about it later on in the show. It was just really interesting, eye-opening in what you were writing there. Also, among the South Asians, if we use that category, there are, as you said, these, high-skilled workers. There are also low-paid, laborers, right? So this kind of a diversity, and would you say that there are more problems faced by the people who don't have skills, and what about the people who do have the skills? Do they face any issues, labor issues?
Yeah, they actually do. And, in the last 15 years, there's been really good work looking at the category of temporary laborers. So, the kinds of laborers that, all our high-tech industries here based in the United States depend on, like Apple and Microsoft. So these workers are called the H-1B visa workers, and they are in very high demand. And of course, they are tech workers, so you would think that they are well paid and well situated. But in fact, what we see is that these corporations subcontract the hiring itself to smaller entities who recruit directly from India or directly from the Middle East and bring workers over. And then, we see that they are abused in terms of, not getting paid the same as, U.S. workers. Recently the Center for Investigative Reporting sort of showed the ways in which because they work for these subcontractors, there's wage theft. They're not paid, adequate benefits. They're locked in with an employer. If they leave an abusive work situation, they're sued by the subcontracting company.
Okay.
So there are a lot of abuses that we feel, now these H-1B workers are becoming quite aware of. And we see that structurally that, they share issues with the low-wage workers in terms of exploitation, not being paid the rightful wages, long hours of work, and being locked into employment situations.
And also their immigration status also made them more vulnerable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, because they're temporary workers and they have to depend on the employer to file for their green card so that they can stay here as legal permanent residents, and that in itself can become quite abusive, that kind of relationship with an employer.
So recently you have been working on anti-deportation. Can you share something about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that deportation, again, it's not an issue that is associated with the South Asian community because the face of the people who are targeted for deportation, in public discourse is Latino. But if you look at, who's being deported, it's from all over. There are undocumented people who become undocumented, who are coming from Europe, who are coming from Asia. It's not just a Latino issue. Okay. Even before 9/11, an organization called DC's Rising Up and Moving was, addressing the crisis in deportation where, family members, who have overstayed a visa or who may have come on a work visa and then stayed on, for one reason or the other had gotten undocumented, were after the 1996 laws were being targeted for removal. And, the community again sort of very quickly identified this as an issue because oftentimes these are men who are being removed, so that puts the family that they are with in crisis in terms of how to maintain their households, whether they're going to take back their whole household, back. And oftentimes they came to this country to escape, some kind of political turmoil or, a dictatorship, military upheavals. So they don't want to take their families back to that dangerous situation.
That's right.
That's how we started to get into that issue. And then, when we talk about the post 9/11 scenario, I can tell you more about how that escalated.
Yeah. In terms of general ways of organizing to bring the awareness either to the public or to the politicians, sorry. What are the methods and means?
Yeah, so in the last decade, I have been really impressed with the ways in which the second generation, the South Asian Americans, people who are either born here or came here at a very young age, many of them, of course, have gone into the usual professional fields and become doctors and lawyers, but others have become advocates and they work for nonprofits. And, many of them are DC based, and so they are, raising awareness as policy groups. They meet regularly with politicians. They always make public statements about, whatever the current issue is that is affecting, Asian immigrants or South Asian immigrants. They also, broadly address issues around immigration. So I would say that those organizations, have been very effective in sort of making South Asians visible to politicians and in somewhat, non-stereotypical ways, I would say.
And I suppose those kind of effort also benefit other immigrants.
Yes, yes, it's very much a solidarity movement. So I can give you a couple of examples.
Yeah, please do.
So, for example, the Domestic Workers Union has, South Asian domestic workers, domestic workers for the Caribbean, domestic workers from African nations, and they all, I'm familiar with what happened in New York State. And as a coalition, they educated themselves. These are working class women, who are working as nannies or doing domestic work, and they would take time off and go to Albany to lobby for a domestic workers' rights bill. And that was for all domestic workers in the state.
Yeah.
It wasn't just for one ethnic group or the other. And they, sort of started to tell the legislators that, we take care of your children, we take care of your elderly, we cook for you, so that you can do these, high-powered jobs. And don't you think that we have the right to work with dignity, to have good wages, to have safe conditions of work? And I think that those testimonies were very, very powerful to get, the law passed.
Right.
So New York State now has a law that, to some degree, protects domestic workers from abuses in the workplace.
Are these domestic workers tend to be women?
They tend to be women mostly. There are men, but it is a highly feminized job. Most of these women, again, they might have been professionals in their country, but here they are unemployable, and so they start thinking, this will be a temporary stopgap measure, babysitting job, and then it turns into an occupation that they are stuck in. Some of them are recruited directly by professionals from Bangladesh or from India, Pakistan. And again, this is another working, like we do work on social networks, right?
Yeah.
So here are these professional South Asians who go to South Asia to recruit other South Asians to come and work in their homes.
Yeah. That's also fascinating because you would think they're all South Asians, but they kind of face different issues.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we, it's been very hard, especially in the South Asian community, to confront these class issues because it's South Asian employers who are, abusing their South Asian employees, their compatriots. So it's a hard issue.
Is that issue brought up in the U.S.?
Yeah, so that was part of the organizing that we did, to kind of call out, our, brothers and sisters.
That's right, yeah.
And in fact, there have been, demonstrations outside of homes where, domestic workers have been, abused, and, we use familiar terms. We say, brothers and sisters, like, you have to pay attention to what is happening to other brothers and sisters.
Right. Yeah.
So, to kind of shame them by, using familiar terms and saying that, you should be taking care of these people instead of abusing them. Not in a paternalistic way, but, to just say that, we know that these things are happening inside your home and it's not okay.
That's really interesting, and so there's another sector in New York, talking about New York, that is the taxi drivers, and that's mostly male from South Asian countries. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and explore that dimension of South Asian communities in the U.S. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. I'm host of Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy, which is our flagship show, which plays 4 to 5 p.m. every Wednesday. And the supporters of that show are Hawaii Energy Policy Forum and Hawaii Energy. And luckily enough, we have representatives of both of them right here today to tell you more about what they think about the show. Sharon Moriwaki at my left is co-chair of Hawaii Energy Policy Forum, and she goes first. Sharon?
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. I'm so glad that we have this Hawaii, the State of Clean Energy. This was 2 years ago when we started this, and we have continued it because it's so important. And there's so many developments happening across the state. And we hope you'll tune in every Wednesday, 4 to 5. It's wonderful.
And Ray is Hawaii Energy. Ray, what is your thought about the same subject?
Well, I agree completely with Sharon that we are talking about every Wednesday, 4 to 5. We talk about some of the most important subjects that are affecting the islands now and into the future. Energy. Clean energy, we need it. We often run into new ideas that we had not thought about before. We did just today, and I think we're going to have more of that in the future. So come on down and watch us 4 to 5 on Wednesdays, and we'll see what happens.
We'll see you then. Aloha.
Aloha.
Hi, we're back. We're live. We're talking about South Asians in the U.S. and immigrant rights with Professor Monisha Das Gupta from UH-Manoa. So let's come to talk about 9/11 and its impact on New York taxi drivers. But in terms of taxi drivers as an industry, there seems to be connected to immigrants in different cities.
That's right. Yeah, you know, taxi driving in the recent years has become a prime, you know, first-generation immigrant occupation, and you know, many people kind of think that you know, the folks who work in the taxi industry have some kind of natural aptitude that makes them fit for the taxi industry, but it is really, you know, sort of an entry point for new immigrants to, you know, make a living because they have the pressures of like immediately needing to support themselves and their families. So, you know, in terms of the ethnic makeup of the industry, it varies from city to city. In New York City, when I was doing my research, you know, 80% of the workforce was South Asian, first-generation immigrants, and many of them Muslim because they're coming from Pakistan or Bangladesh. And even as I was working, you know, the industry was changing toward more Bangladeshi drivers, newer immigrants from Bangladesh. But if you go to DC, you'll see that the taxi driving community is, you know, dominated by African immigrants. If you go to Boston, you know, it'll be Haitian refugees who are driving taxis. So I think that each city has its own sort of very unique ethnic character, depending on, I think, social networks, you know, who can host them for a little bit and they stay in the city and then they enter the industry.
They're probably introduced by friends and say, well, you know, come in here, you have the job.
Absolutely. I think those networks are very important in plugging them into the jobs. Yeah.
Impact of 9/11 on New York taxi drivers, and I don't know, wherever you want to start.
Okay, you know, I started being aware of the organizing that was happening in the taxi industry in New York before 9/11, when I was, you know, doing that other kind of organizing, progressive South Asian organizing, and you know, when in 1997 the first taxi driver strike happened in New York City, even though I'd been working for a while on taxi drivers, there were people who suddenly sort of woke up to the fact that, oh, my God, there are like these South Asian taxi drivers in, you know, New York City, and they're organizing for their rights, which was a very exciting moment. So you already have, you know, a workforce that is starting to get organized, and then 9/11 happens, and I was invited by the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, which was the, you know, the workers center that was organizing taxi workers, to document the impact of 9/11, and you know, because what we saw was that they were, you know, losing income. They were also, you know, being injured on the job because of people assaulting them on the basis of their physical assault on the basis of their appearance.
They were seen as Muslims.
They were seen as Muslims, yes. And you know, every taxi in New York will have the driver's name, you know, that is visible to the rider. And so they would see a name like Ali or Haider or something like that, and they would, you know, say, you're a terrorist. I mean, you know, the taxi drivers have told me, you know, the kinds of, you know, not only verbal abuse, but then, you know, physical abuse from passengers on the basis of their perceived ethnicity. And I, you know, met with a taxi driver, you know, from Bangladesh. He was so badly injured by one of the passengers that he was basically out of work, and he showed me a whole pile of bills that, you know, on his desk that he hasn't been able to pay because of being out of work. So, you know, these were very intense stories that, you know, sort of were important to document, and New York Taxi Workers Alliance asked me to help them with a survey to document the impact of you know, not only economic but also, you know, this sort of kind of psychological, physical assault that was tied to loss of income for the drivers.
And so they can, the drivers can experience clearly there's a break between like before 9/11 and after.
Yeah. So you know, one of the drivers told me that, you know, I never thought I would say this, because before 9/11 the conditions in the industry were not so good, but after 9/11, you know, not only has my income dropped, but I don't take pleasure in my work anymore, because I'm always out there afraid that somebody is going to say something to me that will be hurtful, so, or somebody will physically hurt me because they think I'm a terrorist. And if you remember, I mean, you know, 9/11 is sort of thankfully hazy for us right now,
That's
but
right.
you know, there was a really, you know, terrible assault on Muslim-looking, you know, South Asian, Middle Eastern communities at that time, and you know, these people were not only, the drivers were not only facing this in their work, during their work day or work night, their wives were being harassed if their wives, you know, had any kind of head covering. If they went out, they were afraid because, you know, people would snatch at their scarves, head scarves. Their children were being teased in school and harassed in school. So they felt very beleaguered at, you know, at that moment.
Oh, definitely. You know, you read so much about it, and it's spreading far beyond just the taxi drivers.
Yeah.
But in terms of the taxi driver industry, especially industry that's concentrated by South Asians, do other people like Indians, non-Muslims, also get harassed because they were taken as Muslims?
Yes, yes. And I think that one of the things that I heard, you know, very frequently after 9/11 was, you know, there is this term among the black community, you know, driving while black, right? So this term flying while brown came up, you know, because when people were flying, you know, trying to, you know, get on airplanes, if they looked South Asian or they looked Middle Eastern, you know, they would be, you know, asked to, you know, get off the plane. They would be questioned, you know, harassed. And, you know, I think that that's an indicator of, you know, a kind of shift in the environment. But I think that it wasn't the first time that South Asians have faced discrimination. You know, it was a very intense moment of discrimination where it, you know, lies on a continuum of, you know, there be South Asians being targeted for very many reasons. But I think for middle class, protected, you know, professional people, that was their first taste of being treated as foreigners, as threats to the nation. So I think that was a wake-up call for the whole community.
Wow. So I suppose they also, well, post 9/11, you also have probably less tourists and less people taking the taxi.
Yes.
That's another hit on the industry, right?
Yes. So tourism dropped, you know, remarkably during that period, and the industry suffered because of that. But there were also people who would not ride a particular taxi because of who was driving it, and there was, you know, the city was shut down, you know, so people lost their fares, especially in southern Manhattan, they lost fares. But, you know, one of the things that I think, you know, bears, you know, repeating here is that many of these drivers, even though they themselves were suffering economically and not being able to support their families, whether their families were in New York or, you know, in South Asia, because they send remittances back to support these families, they contributed to the recovery efforts. So they would give free rides, you know, to the people who were working at the World Trade Center, you know, digging and trying to recover bodies, you know. They donated rides to folks who, you know, the first few days when people were just, there was no transportation and people were walking. So they felt like they, in their own way, should express their love and belonging to the city. And, you know, they were met with so much hostility. And I think that was very traumatic for them. You know, one of the Bangladeshi drivers that I talked to said, you know, all throughout that day, you know, I gave so many free rides, and then when I went back to my neighborhood after such a long, exhausting, horrible day, you know, people threw eggs at me in my neighborhood. It was my neighborhood, and people threw eggs at me.
That's really hard.
So,
Has there been effort among the South Asian communities to address this in New York?
Yes, I think that it brought our community together, across class divisions, across, other types of divisions. And, there were different responses. Some of them were, sort of presenting ourselves as the good immigrants, like we are not the terrorists.
That's right.
Others who are more progressive, really challenged this whole, idea around, who is a terrorist, and sort of then blanket, applying those definitions to a whole ethnic group. So I think that there were different efforts, but at least there were efforts. I think that it was, a good experience in some ways for our community to realize that we have to stand up and fight for our rights in this country.
Definitely. Those are so many important issues that you have addressed. But before the show ends, I want to make sure to give you the opportunity, because you have been the director of the Center for South Asian Studies at UH-Manoa.
Yeah.
Talk about opportunities to study South Asian issues at the university.
Yeah, so we are very, very lucky to have excellent faculty who are affiliated with our center, who offer a wide variety of courses for us to become familiar with South Asia. Politics, culture, religion, art, language. So you can learn Sanskrit, you can learn Hindi. We have excellent faculty who are very student oriented. We have a very new study abroad program, and we can, given the quality of applications, even support a couple of students to go on study abroad based in Delhi at a university that is named after one of the first sort of, Dalit sort of leaders of the country, who was a framer of our constitution. And we want our students and faculty to avail of that opportunity. We also, would like to just, foster an interest in the region, because globally, it's become so important. Like, I think, India and China are always talked about as, the two sort of powers in India. And I don't want to use it as, sort of just saying, oh, economically India is growing and that's why we should be interested. Strategically, it's important for us. I think South Asia is a fascinating, country where we see, many issues. It's a great place to study some of the issues around, wealth inequality, issues around social movements, issues around environmental justice, issues around, women's rights. So you can, go to South Asia and study all of these issues in a very grounded way, and it's a very hospitable place, and everybody that I've met who've had that kind of experience, who are not South Asians, really appreciate it.
And you're talking about the bachelor's program and also graduate program as well, right?
Both undergraduates and graduates. Thank you for that.
And in terms of topics, as you said, there are so many different kind of topics you can study.
Yeah.
And you have faculty members in all different kind of
including your department, where
geography department.
Rhys Jones offer.
Right.
He has a specialty in Bangladesh, and that's why we value him so much.
That's right. Professor Rhys Jones has come to this show also to talk about border issues.
Yes.
Yeah. And we also on this show has Professor Shankar from English department talking about the literature.
Yes.
And identity politics.
Yeah.
Sound like you have exciting programs that you offer to students.
Yeah, and we would want the students of Hawaii and people of Hawaii take a greater interest in South Asia, because we are neighbors, and there are lots of traditional, circuits that have connected these regions.
And your own work, right now you are doing work on anti-deportation, and any other work you have been involved right now?
Yeah, so, I'm working on the movement is multiracial, but as you know, after 9/11, the South Asian community was particularly targeted for deportation. There was a special registration program for South Asian men, adult men, and what we discovered, again thanks to activists, is that the program was actually used to find who was in violation of their immigration status, and then used to deport elderly men, younger men, and this created a huge crisis in our community. And I think that to have South Asian, activists there to support both, the people who are going in for special registration, the the families and raise awareness in the community that this was going on has been very, very important.
What's really fascinating and so important in terms of your work is that it's both a scholarship and also on the ground helping people.
Yeah.
And that makes a huge difference. And so I hope more people will check out UH-Manoa, the South Asian Studies. Again, thank you so much, Monisha, for joining us.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed this.
And that is Professor Monisha Das Gupta from UH-Manoa on South Asians in the U.S. and immigrants' rights. And I want to thank you, the viewers, for joining in. We'll see you next time.